Yeah, well, and this is, the one of the facts, interesting context of reality is recursion, right?
Hmm.
And bootstrapping, right? That everything about life is recursive. It's like it's iterative. Something happens and then it happens again and it happens again, and it builds into something bigger that becomes its own macro level piece of the environment, and then that becomes a piece of the environment that things adapt against, and that recurs. There's recursion, iteration, right?
Hmm.
Where each thing bootstraps the next and bootstraps the next. So while I think it is absolutely undeniable that myth came before science,
Yes.
right? In the largest scheme of things, that the archetypes of masculine, feminine, or male, female,
Yes.
the archetype of parent, child, right, was that what existed before human consciousness, right? There was male and female, parent and child, predator and prey, before humans, in Jason Alexander's poetic terms, came to terms with the world. Before we developed language, before we started naming things, before we came to terms with the world, the first initial human creation, that once we started coming to terms with the world, we became human. Right? This
Yes.
is the distinguishing fact of human being and everything that comes from that. When we came to terms with the world, we came to terms with a world that already existed archetypally. There
That's
was
right.
predator and prey. There was known and unknown. There was parent and child. There was male and female. Like, these fundamental differences are previous to human consciousness. And that the process of coming to terms with reality, right, came to terms with the reality that was already there.
Yes.
And the narratives that we built with that, because we didn't have science, we didn't have the levels of abstraction that we could start to say, well, is that true? Well, what do you mean by true? There's kind of two kinds of truth. And Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris come down to
Hmm.
this. Jordan Peterson says, no, what's true is male, female, predator, prey, life, death,
Hmm.
that you have to make choices, that you're on the border of unknown and known. Like, that's truth. That's the previous to scientific rational articulation. And scientific rational articulation is on top of that. That's a little thing in this much larger context.
That's right.
Right?
Yes.
And if we look at it in terms of recursion and iteration and bootstrapping, right, the first stories we told were our attempts to abstract predator and prey, parent and child, right,
Yes.
male and female, known and unknown. We were creating stories which were approximations. They're narrative structures to try to capture an underlying reality. So those first myths are the equivalent of science, in the sense that they are attempts to abstract the nature of reality into a conceptual framework that we can work with.
Yes.
Okay, so in that sense, the myths that we created were absolutely science. They were an attempt to abstract into a language form something conceptual that we could use to interact with the world to become more powerful. And if you think about it that way, then science is just the latest iteration of this recursive process of coming to terms with reality. And then I'm going to use Jason Alexander's work for a bit. And then the Greeks came to terms with terms, right? They started looking at language and started going, wait a minute. Some of these, there's all these different stories out there. what's common amongst the stories? And they started creating concepts about concepts.
Mm-hmm.
They
Yeah.
created philosophy, this study of understanding, the study of when we came to terms with the world, how do we come to terms? Epistemology. What's the world we're coming to terms with? Metaphysics. Most of our stories about how do we act? What is good? What should we do? By what criteria do we make choices towards better or worse? Ethics. Right? How do we work with one another? What's an appropriate way for one human being to relate to another? And how do we do that as a group? What kinds of rules and policies and games and laws can we create that optimize for ethics, given our knowledge, epistemology of reality, metaphysics? Right? What are the political structures? Politics. And then fifth, art. We recognize that some of these stories are designed not for understanding of politics, not to define ethics in terms of a set of rules, not to understand like how things actually work, not to figure out what's the fundament of reality. But these aesthetic stories, these narratives, are designed to impact us on unconscious mythological levels. And you could say the Greeks came to terms with terms. They looked at this mental world, this conceptual world that we were creating over the previous 100 or 10,000 years, depending on how you think about it, right? Since we had language. How does language shape our thinking? And philosophy went, I'm in my thinking. Let me think about thinking. Let me come to terms with terms. And that philosophical revolution led to science, right? You could say that we had this revolution and there was Plato and Aristotle. And Plato said the fundamental reality is transcendent. And in order to access the transcendent reality, to get true knowledge, you need to be a philosopher. And you need to be a mystical philosopher who gets in touch with this great knowledge. And they should actually be kings. They should be the ones dictating how everybody else lives their lives because they're in touch with the truth.
Mm-hmm.
It's a top-down perspective. And Aristotle, his student, came along and said, yeah, not so much. Right? What we do is we start at the bottom. We start with reality and then we work our way up. And we actually design our ethics, we design our politics, we design our aesthetics out of our knowledge of reality. It's bottom up. Right? In this fundamental battle, Plato won the first round. Aristotle was lost. Christianity and a Platonic version of Christianity came into existence. And that time, unfortunately, we call the Dark Ages because Rome fell and everything fell apart with it. Right? And it wasn't until the rebirth of Aristotle, the rebirth of the bottom-up perspective in the Renaissance, when we actually got the Aristotelian texts back from the Islamic scholars who had gotten them.
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle got lost in the West, but was found and incorporated into early Islam. And during the Crusades, we actually started getting Aristotelian texts back, and that created the Renaissance. The rebirth of what? The rebirth of a bottom-up perspective. Not top-down, but bottom-up. This, let's look at reality and build from there and build from there. This Korzybskian perspective.
Yes.
This Sam Harris perspective of, no, we want to deal with reality as clearly as possible so that the abstractions we build on that. And aesthetics is the top abstraction. The stories we tell, the artistry we bring to those stories ought to be built on our best knowledge of actual reality and our best knowledge and our best ethics and our best politics. Let's create an aesthetics that actually expresses that versus a top-down perspective where the aesthetics is the main thing and then we fit our politics into it, we fit our ethics into it, we fit our knowledge and science into it. That led to the Renaissance. where we
Yes.
came to terms with the self, right? And the fact that human beings are making choices, and we had the birth of the self, this rebirth of human creativity. And then that led to what Jason Alexander calls the fourth revolution. The first revolution was we came to terms with reality. That was a metaphysical revolution.
Yes.
Then we came to terms with terms. That was an epistemological revolution. Then we came to terms with the self and creativity in the Renaissance, and we actually said, wait a minute. No, we're coming back to the human being who gets to create. And we started creating structures where human beings were allowed to create, where they weren't limited by the church. And then we came to the fourth revolution, which he calls the American Revolution. This is the political revolution, where we actually said, no, the individual, right? In terms of politics, the individual is the fundamental unit of politics. We will have individual rights. We will set up a political system that honors the individual, in which everyone is on the same playing field, right? A government of laws, not men, not human beings. No one is above the law. There are no special people who are above the law, who are kings, who are beyond the law. Everyone is to be treated the same, individual rights. Now, of course, there were a lot of very difficult social situations to incorporate into that. I don't know, like slavery.
Slavery, yeah.
Yes, right. But they were working that out. Slavery had existed forever, right? We're working this out. So this fourth revolution, coming to terms, right, with the individual vis-a-vis other individual, this American Revolution, the revolution of civilization, where we actually civilize towards one another. We respect each person's individual rights, regardless of their creed, regardless of their station at birth. And everyone is subject to the same laws. Instead of the government controlling individuals, we're going to flip that paradigm on its head and put the individual first, and the government is what we limit. Right? The U.S. Constitution, every single word limits government, not individuals. It's about how do we limit government from infringing on individual freedoms.
Yes.
Right? How do we create a state? How do we create a system that has enough power that it can function, that it can maintain laws, that it can maintain courts, that it can maintain a military and protect our borders? Right? How do we create that? Enough structure, enough governmental power that it can do that, but no more. How do we limit it? That was the American Revolution, this fundamental process, and that was a political revolution.
Which was a breakthrough, given especially where they're coming from king dictatorship,
Yes.
right? Coming from King George and the British.
Coming
right?
from every other society in existence.
And every other society,
except for perhaps the Roman Republic that they were attempting to do, which is why we're not a the United States is not a democracy; it's a republic, right? It's not just unlimited majority rule; it's representative government limited by laws, right? The government cannot go beyond its prescribed limitations, supposedly anyway. Almost all of them are gone, but theoretically, it was this incredible political experiment. I think it was the greatest political experiment in human history. I think it has still to be equaled, that fundamental idea. And Jason Alexander suggested that we were headed into the fifth revolution at this time, that we are right now in the fifth revolution. It's a revolution of aesthetics, a revolution of creativity. I call it the revolution of realization. And this is where we start to get creative about being creative. And the thing that really interests me about Jordan Peterson, when we're looking at this Jordan Peterson-Korzybski thing, is that Jordan Peterson is bringing the level of narrative to the fore, making it front and center in a way that challenges the scientific narrative. In this sense, he's fundamentally postmodern. If we say that Korzybski and Sam Harris are representing the fundamentally modern perspective, the Enlightenment perspective, that we can understand reality, and the more we understand reality, the more knowledge we create. The more knowledge we create, the more we know what to do is good, right? Metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, right? We know what's good, and therefore we can organize our groups according to what's good. And now we can build a story on top of that. Peterson is coming in and saying, whoa, this story is fundamental. The story is what's fundamental. You can't forget that.